Right. Getting ready to unpack some serious philosophical baggage today.
Yay.
We're taking a deep dive, into the world of Giles of Rome, who was a major figure in, like, late 13th century thought.
Okay, yeah.
This guy, Giles, was a philosophical powerhouse,
Yeah.
left behind just mountains of work,
Oh, yeah.
commentaries on Aristotle, theological treatises, and even some forays into the world of politics.
Right.
So pretty fascinating figure.
What makes Giles so fascinating, I think, is that he was really grappling with some of the sort of like deepest questions that still resonate with philosophers today,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So the relationship between faith and reason, the nature of knowledge, the structure of reality itself. And he was doing all of this while kind of navigating like the turbulent intellectual waters of his time.
Oh, I bet. Just trying to reconcile Aristotle with Christian theology.
Right.
Seems like a headache-inducing project.
It is.
And our sources suggest that Giles wasn't afraid to kind of get in there and mix it up, even butting heads with his supposed mentor, Thomas Aquinas, on some pretty fundamental issues.
Exactly, yeah. So he wasn't just blindly following the philosophical giants who came before him.
Right.
He was really engaging with their ideas, pushing them further, and sometimes even kind of turning them on their heads.
Love that. Okay, so before we dive into all the intricacies of his philosophy,
Yeah.
I think it would be good to paint a picture of Giles's life. Our sources suggest a pretty fascinating journey from, the quiet halls of academia to the halls of power.
For sure.
So give us that overview,
Indeed. So he was born in Rome,
hence the name.
hence the name, and became a prominent theologian within the Augustinian hermits. But his intellectual journey took him to Paris, which was kind of, the epicenter of philosophical debate in the 13th century.
Yeah.
And there, he really immersed himself in the world of Aristotelian thought, which was causing quite a stir in the church.
It's almost like he was drawn to the intellectual firestorm.
Right.
And speaking of firestorms, our sources mentioned that he even got tangled up in the 1277 condemnation of what they called heterodox Aristotelianism. What was that all about?
Yeah, so in the 13th century, there was a lot of anxiety in the church about the influx of Aristotelian ideas, especially those that seemed to challenge core Christian doctrines.
Right.
Some thinkers were kind of pushing the boundaries of Aristotelianism in ways that, raised eyebrows, to say the least. And so you have this kind of classic clash between, like, traditional dogma and the kind of restless spirit of philosophical inquiry.
Right.
Right.
Always a good time.
Yeah, and Giles, despite his, very deep theological commitments, finds himself right in the middle of this intellectual tug of war, right? He's pushing the boundaries of Aristotelian thought, he's exploring its implications for theology, and sometimes even kind of going against the grain of, the established interpretations.
Love that. That's what I love about this guy. He's not just a passive recipient of tradition. He's actively shaping it.
Yeah.
Questioning it,
Yeah.
trying to forge something new.
Exactly, yeah. And so, his life kind of reflects this intellectual boldness. So, after Paris, he returns to Italy. He becomes the head of his order, the Augustinians. And then, boom, he's appointed the Archbishop of Bourges by Pope Boniface VIII. Talk about a career change, right?
Right, from quiet scholar to archbishop navigating the treacherous waters of church politics.
Yeah, exactly.
This wasn't some ivory tower philosopher. He was deeply involved in the power struggles and the controversies of his time.
For sure.
He even wrote a treatise defending the Pope's authority against the King of France.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, he was a man of both profound intellect, right, and also, like, this practical acumen. He was able to move kind of seamlessly between the world of, these abstract philosophical ideas and the messy realities of political life and that dual engagement, right? I mean, this engagement with philosophy and politics really kind of shaped his thinking.
It's very cool. Okay, well, let's delve into the mind of this philosophical chameleon. But I think for us philosophy buffs, I think the natural place to start is with his contributions to logic and rhetoric.
Okay, sounds good.
After all, every great philosophical system needs a solid foundation in how we think and communicate.
An excellent point, yeah.
So what did Giles bring to the table in these areas?
So Giles was deeply involved in a movement known as modistic logic, which basically focused on the semantics of intentions, mental concepts.
Okay.
So you can think of this as a kind of medieval exploration of what we might call philosophy of language today.
Okay, so they're trying to unpack the relationship between words and thoughts and the things they refer to.
Precisely, yeah. And Giles had some interesting disagreements with other prominent modists about the nature of signification. So he rejected the idea that, the essential form of a word's meaning is its significatio.
Its capacity to point to something else.
Right, exactly.
Hold on, so what did he think words signify?
So he argued that the meaning of a word is a concept, an intentio, that signifies the thing itself. So it's not just the simple act of pointing or referring,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's this intermediary, a mental representation that mediates between the word and the world.
Ah, so the word tree doesn't just, directly refer to like a physical tree.
Right,
It points to our mental concept of a tree,
right.
which then allows us to grasp the actual tree out there in the
You've
world.
got it, exactly. So it really highlights the role of our minds in constructing meaning.
Yeah.
The idea that we don't just passively receive information from the world,
Hmm.
but we actively interpret it through the lens of our concepts.
That's pretty insightful.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how much of what we perceive as reality is actually shaped by our own mental frameworks.
That's right. I mean, that's a question that's haunted philosophers for centuries, right? But we shouldn't forget Giles's work on rhetoric,
True, yeah.
right? Because even the most profound ideas are useless if we can't communicate them effectively.
That's true. So how did Giles approach the art of persuasion?
Well, he wrote a commentary on Aristotle's rhetoric, kind
Mhm.
of, delving into all the intricacies of argumentation, the use of emotional appeals, the importance of understanding your audience. He even builds upon Aquinas' theory of passions, right? Exploring how emotions influence our judgments and decisions.
So it's not just about cold logic.
Right.
It's about understanding the psychology of persuasion,
Yeah.
how to move people's hearts and minds.
Precisely, yeah. And some scholars have even argued that Giles saw rhetoric as kind of the logic of ethics and politics.
Interesting.
Right, a way of bridging the gap between like abstract principles and the messy realities of human action.
Right. So it's not just about winning arguments.
Yeah.
It's about finding ways to translate, philosophical insights into practical guidance
Right.
for how we should, live and govern ourselves.
Exactly, yeah. And this emphasis on the practical application of philosophical ideas, I think, is really a hallmark of Giles's thought.
Yeah.
He wasn't content to just kind of ponder, these abstract concepts in isolation. He really wanted to see how they played out in the real world, how they could inform our understanding of, everything from the nature of reality to, the best way to organize society.
All right. So you've definitely piqued my curiosity. Now let's move beyond logic and rhetoric and dive into, I guess, the heart of Giles's philosophical system. Starting with his metaphysical views on knowledge and reality, I'm ready for some serious mind-bending concepts.
Oh, you won't be disappointed.
Good.
Yeah, yeah. And this is where we really see Giles, I think, challenging the traditional view of him as just a follower of Aquinas, right?
Yeah.
He really takes on some of the biggest questions in metaphysics, head on, and offers his own, like, unique, sometimes controversial interpretations.
Like the age-old distinction between essence and existence, right?
Yeah.
That's a topic that's kept philosophers up at night for
A
centuries.
philosophical puzzle for the ages.
Yes.
Yeah, and Giles doesn't shy away from it. In fact, he takes Aquinas's, real distinction, this idea that essence and existence are really distinct in created beings,
Mm-hmm.
and pushes it even further. He asserts that existence is a res addita, something added to essence.
Hold on. So he's building on Aquinas' ideas, but then
Mhm.
but then taking them in a direction that seems to go against Aquinas' own leanings.
Exactly, yeah. So it's a bold move that aligns more closely with the thought of, say, Avicenna, who's, an Islamic philosopher who had a huge influence on medieval thought.
Right.
And it shows how Giles, kind of uses Aquinas as a springboard for his own philosophical explorations,
Yeah.
even if it means diverging from his supposed mentor.
I'm starting to see a pattern here.
Yeah.
Giles is not afraid to, respectfully disagree with
Yeah.
with even the biggest names in philosophy.
Right.
He's forging his own path, synthesizing different traditions
Yeah.
and coming up with something truly unique.
Yeah, that's a great observation.
Okay.
And we see that independent streak, I think, in other areas of his thought as well, like his views on creation.
Okay, let's talk about creation.
Yeah.
How does Giles, a devout Christian theologian, reconcile the idea of creation with Aristotelian philosophy, which doesn't really have a concept of a beginning of the universe.
Right. So he does it, I think, by boldly asserting the compatibility of Aristotle with Christian faith.
Hmm.
And he goes so far as to argue that esse being and creation are ultimately identical.
Hmm.
So in his view, creation isn't just an event that happened in the past. It's an ongoing process, the very ground of being itself.
So he's not shying away from potential conflicts between faith and reason. He's actively trying to find common ground,
Right.
to weave them together into a coherent worldview.
Exactly. And it shows his deep commitment to both, revelation
Hmm.
and philosophical inquiry.
Right.
This belief that these two sources of knowledge can ultimately illuminate and enrich each other.
It's quite a balancing act.
It is.
But now let's dive into his theory of knowledge itself.
Okay.
How did Giles believe we come to know the world around us?
So this is where his causal interpretation of cognition comes in. So he believes that knowledge, whether it's sensory or intellectual, is fundamentally a causal process,
Hmm.
right? Something acts on our senses or intellect, leading to a cognitive effect,
Yeah.
a representation of the object in our minds.
Okay, so it's not just a passive reception of information.
Mm.
There's an active interaction between the knower and the known, a kind of like meeting of the minds.
Exactly, yeah. And
Hmm.
this is where things get really interesting, especially for philosophers, because Giles introduces the concept of intelligible species. Okay, or formales expressiones, as he often calls them.
Okay, break that down for me. What are these intelligible species, and what role do they play in knowledge?
Okay, so think of them as a kind of mental intermediary,
Mm-hmm.
right? When we can't directly perceive an object with our senses
Right.
or grasp it directly with our intellect,
Mm-hmm.
these intelligible species step in. They're mental representations of the object that allow us to know it indirectly.
So if I'm picturing a tree in my mind,
Right,
even though there's no actual tree in front of me,
right.
I'm using an intelligible species to grasp the concept of tree.
Precisely, yeah. And Giles really wrestled with the ontological status of these intelligible species, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are they exactly? Are they material? Are they immaterial? Are they something else altogether? And he acknowledges, the difficulties in kind of pinning them down, even suggesting that they might be neither substance nor accident,
Mm-hmm.
which are the two basic categories of being in Aristotelian philosophy.
Sounds like a real philosophical head-scratcher.
It is, yeah.
So even as Giles lays out a very sophisticated theory of knowledge,
Yeah.
he leaves us with some unresolved puzzles.
That's the beauty of philosophy. It often raises as many questions as it answers.
That's right.
Right. It kind of pushes us to think deeper and grapple with complexity. And Giles, as we'll see, wasn't afraid to do just that in his natural philosophy as well.
Okay, now you've really got me hooked. Let's delve into Giles's explorations of the natural world in part 2 of our deep dive.
Picking up where we left off, Giles, just couldn't resist delving into Aristotle's physics, taking those metaphysical concepts about the natural world, and really running with them.
Okay, so what's an example of how Giles kind of went beyond Aristotle here? What kind of philosophical rabbit holes did he dig into?
Well, one area that I think is especially intriguing, especially for philosophers, is his work on place and motion. You remember Aristotle's theory, right? About how everything has a natural place. Giles takes that idea and adds some serious nuance to it, distinguishing between what he calls material place and formal place.
Okay, I'm sensing a distinction of philosophical significance here.
Right.
Walk me through it. What's the difference?
Okay, so material place for Giles is the immediate boundary or container of a thing. So think of it like, the inside of a glass holding water,
Okay.
right? That glass defines the water's material place.
Okay.
Formal place, on the other hand, is more about a thing's position relative to kind of fixed points in the universe,
Mhm.
kind of like coordinates on a map.
Okay, so one is about the immediate surroundings.
Right.
The other is about the location within a larger cosmic framework.
Exactly, yeah. And some scholars think this distinction actually kind of foreshadows later debates in physics about the nature of space itself. It's like he's hinting at the difference between relational and absolute space, centuries before those concepts were fully developed.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing for a 13th century thinker. It really shows how these medieval philosophers were wrestling with questions that are still relevant to, modern physics.
Right.
But let's talk about another big one time. How did Giles, with his love of Aristotle, How did he approach this ever-elusive concept?
Yeah, this is where it gets really fascinating, especially I think for anyone who's interested in the philosophy of time,
Hmm.
because Giles didn't see time as just a kind of way of measuring motion,
Right.
like a clock ticking away.
Hmm.
He argues that time is motion itself, just viewed from a different perspective.
Whoa, that's a pretty radical reframing of time.
Yeah.
So instead of being separate from movement, time is a way of experiencing it or conceptualizing.
Exactly. It's like saying, a movie isn't a series of still frames, but rather the illusion of motion created by those frames flashing before our eyes.
Hmm.
Right. Time for Giles is the illusion of flow that arises from the kind of constant change and movement happening in the universe.
Okay, so I think I'm starting to wrap my head around this.
Okay.
But you mentioned earlier that Giles believed in different kinds of time.
That's right, yeah, because if time is ultimately rooted in motion, right, and there are different kinds of motion, then there must be different kinds of time as well.
Hmm.
So he distinguishes between what he calls extrinsic duration, which is the time that's kind of linked to the celestial movements, the stars and planets,
Hmm.
and intrinsic duration, which is the time that's connected to the more chaotic and ever-changing motions here on Earth.
So the heavens have their own time, distinct from the time that we experience here on Earth. That's a pretty wild idea. It kind of reminds me of those theories in physics about different reference frames for time.
Exactly, yeah. It's almost as if Giles is anticipating those ideas in a way. And it gets even more complex when you consider, his debates with other thinkers like Henry of Ghent about the nature of angelic time.
Angelic time. Okay, you've really piqued my philosophical curiosity. But
Yeah.
what was that debate all about?
So both Giles and Henry believe that angels, being purely spiritual beings, exist in a kind of time that's different from our own,
Hmm.
right? They see it as a kind of like discrete succession of instants rather than a continuous flow.
Okay.
But they disagreed about how this, angelic time relates to our earthly time. So Henry really kind of pushes back against this idea of Giles that multiple instants of angelic time could correspond to a single instant of our time.
So it's a debate about, I guess, like the relative speeds or densities of different kinds of time. Fascinating. It's amazing to think that these medieval thinkers were already grappling with these incredibly complex questions about time, centuries before, the advent of modern physics and relativity.
Right. It's a testament, I think, to the enduring power of philosophical inquiry, right?
Hmm.
They were really pushing the boundaries of human understanding, even without the tools and concepts that we have today.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't forget that Giles wasn't just this, abstract metaphysician.
Mhm.
He also explored areas where philosophy kind of intersects with other disciplines, like medicine.
Oh, this sounds intriguing.
Yeah.
What did a 13th century philosopher have to say about the world of bodies and health?
Well, he wrote a treatise called the Formatione Corporis Humani in Utero,
Okay.
which basically means on the formation of the human body in the womb. And in it, he jumps headfirst into this debate about the roles of male and female parents in conception.
That's a topic that's always been loaded with philosophical and cultural baggage.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, at the time, there was this tension between, the kind of traditional Galenic view, which
Right.
was inherited from ancient Greek medicine, and the Aristotelian view. So Galen believed that both men and women contributed a kind of seed or sperm to conception,
Okay.
while Aristotle argued that only the male sperm had an active formative role.
Okay, so Galen's side is more of a like collaborative effort,
Right.
while Aristotle gives the male a more dominant role in shaping the offspring.
Exactly, yeah. And Giles, being a devoted Aristotelian, sides with, this idea that female sperm, if it even exists, doesn't play a formal role in the embryo's development. He draws heavily on the Islamic philosopher Averro's interpretation of Aristotle on this point.
So even in his, natural philosophy, we see Giles trying to synthesize, insights from different philosophical traditions,
Right.
weaving together, ancient Greek thought with Islamic interpretations and his own theological commitments.
Precisely, yeah. And this leads him to some conclusions that, might seem strange to us today. Like, for example, he argues that, in those cases where children resemble their mothers, which seems to contradict, this idea of male dominance in reproduction, he explains that away by saying, well, that's just the resistance of the female matter to the shaping power of the male form.
So it's not that the female contributes nothing, but that her contribution is purely material, like a kind of like passive canvas on which the male form imprints itself. It's a fascinating window into how, philosophical assumptions can shape our understanding of biological processes.
It shows how even the most, brilliant minds can be influenced by the prevailing ideas of their time,
Yeah.
right? But let's shift gears now and explore Giles' thoughts on ethics and political theory. This is where, philosophy really gets down to earth, impacting how we live our lives and organize our societies.
Okay. I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty of how Giles thought we should live and govern ourselves.
All right.
What were some of his core ideas about right and wrong, justice and power?
Well, like many medieval thinkers, Giles was heavily influenced by Aristotle's ethical and political writings. But as always, he brought his own, unique perspective to the table.
What were some of those unique perspectives?
Well, one area where he really stands out, I think, is in his understanding of the relationship between the intellect and will in human action.
Mm-hmm.
And this gets right to the heart of, moral philosophy.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
How did Giles see this interplay between reason and desire in shaping our choices?
So he was trying to carve out, I think, a kind of middle ground between two other prominent thinkers of the time, Henry of Ghent and Geoffrey of Fontaines.
Mm-hmm.
So Henry put a lot of emphasis on the intellect's role in guiding the will, while Geoffrey really stressed the will's freedom and independence.
So it's a classic debate about whether our actions are driven by reason or desire.
Right.
Whether we're rational beings or slaves to our passions. What was Giles's take on this?
So he argues that the will is ultimately a passive potency, which is a fancy philosophical way of saying it can't act on its own, right? It needs to be moved by an object, something it perceives as good and desirable.
Okay, so we're drawn towards things that appeal to us, that seem beneficial or pleasurable.
Exactly, yeah. But here's the key point for philosophers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Giles didn't think this passivity negates the will's freedom. He argues that even though the will is moved by its object, it still has a choice in how it responds. It has the power to determine itself and other potencies towards action.
Okay, so I'm trying to follow the logic here.
Yeah.
So we're attracted to things that we perceive as good,
Right.
but we still have a say in whether we pursue them. It's not just a simple cause and effect relationship.
That's the idea, yeah. It's a subtle distinction.
Yeah.
But it's crucial, I think, for understanding Giles's view of free will. And it connects to his understanding of sin as well.
Yeah.
So Giles believed that sin always involves some ignorance of the true good.
Okay.
Right. But he didn't see this ignorance as, like, the root cause of sin.
Mm.
Instead, he argued that it's a consequence of a will that's been corrupted by militia.
Wait, what is militia exactly?
So it's a kind of, like, inner vice or wickedness,
Okay.
a distortion of our desires and affections that leads us astray, right? So this corruption of the will, it kind of clouds our judgment and makes us embrace what is ultimately, harmful or wrong, even if we know intellectually that it's not good for us.
So it's not just a matter of knowing right from wrong.
Right.
It's about having a will that's properly ordered,
Yeah.
a heart that's aligned with the true good.
Exactly, yeah. And this emphasis on the role of the will, I think, in ethical decision-making is a key feature of Giles's moral philosophy.
It sounds like he's saying that intellectual knowledge isn't enough. We need to cultivate virtuous desires, right? To train our hearts as well as our minds.
Exactly, yeah. But let's zoom out a bit now and talk about Giles's political thought.
Okay.
Especially his famous work, De Regimine Principum.
Ah, yes, the Mirror for Princes genre, a classic of medieval political theory.
Yeah.
What were some of Giles' key ideas in this work?
Well, first off, I think it's worth noting how he structured the work itself.
Okay.
He divides it into 3 books, focusing on ethics, economics, and politics, respectively. And this, 3-part scheme, it kind of drew inspiration from Aristotle's ethics, politics, and rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
And it became quite influential in later medieval thought.
Okay, so he's offering a comprehensive guide for rulers, covering everything from personal virtue and household management to statecraft and international relations.
Precisely, yeah. And he covers a wide range of topics within this framework, from the importance of education and the dangers of tyranny to the proper use of law and the role of the common good. But one of the most, fascinating aspects of De Regiment, I think, is how Giles uses Aristotle's own arguments to support his own views.
Hmm.
even when those views go against Aristotle's explicit positions.
Okay, now you've really got my attention. Tell me more about this philosophical maneuvering. What did Giles do?
So he was a staunch advocate for monarchy as the best form of government.
Okay.
Right? And he skillfully kind of wields Aristotle's own arguments to bolster this view, even though Aristotle himself, argued for a mixed constitution
Right.
that combined elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy.
So he's taking the tools of Aristotelian political philosophy
Yeah.
and constructing a different political edifice
Right.
than the one Aristotle envisioned.
Right,
It's
exactly.
almost like he's out Aristotling Aristotle.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. I mean, it's a testament, I think, to Giles's intellectual dexterity, his ability to really engage with philosophical ideas critically and creatively, adapting them to his own, context and purposes.
Yeah. It's also a reminder, I think, that philosophical concepts can be used to support different, even opposing political positions.
Right.
It makes you wonder how much of Giles's, pro-monarchy stance
Mm-hmm.
was driven by genuine philosophical conviction
Right.
versus, the political realities of his time, his close ties to the papacy and his own position as an archbishop.
That's a question worth pondering, yeah.
Yeah.
It reminds us, I think, that philosophers, even the most, rigorous and abstract thinkers, are always embedded in a particular historical and political context
Mhm.
that inevitably shapes their ideas and how they use them.
Right. That's a great point. But Giles's engagement with political theory went beyond de regimen. He also wrote other treatises that kind of delve into the often contentious relationship between secular and ecclesiastical power.
Absolutely, yeah. He was right in the thick of those debates, defending papal authority
Hmm.
and grappling with the complex interplay between church and state.
Okay, I'm eager to hear more about this. What did Giles have to say about these perennial power struggles between popes and kings?
Well, one key work is his treatise De Renunciatione Papae, which he wrote to defend Pope Boniface VIII after the, rather dramatic abdication of Pope Celestine V.
Okay, so we're talking some serious papal drama here. What was Giles's take on this whole situation?
So he argued that Celestine's abdication was perfectly lawful. He pointed out that, even though papal power comes from God, it's bestowed on a specific person through a human act, right? The election by the cardinals.
So it's like a two-step process. God establishes the papacy, but humans decide who fills the role.
Precisely, yeah. And this means that a pope can relinquish that divinely ordained power through a human act as well, abdication. Mm-hmm.
So Giles is pretty clever here, right? He manages to kind of, uphold the sanctity of the papal office
Right.
while also allowing for the possibility of a pope stepping down.
Some impressive philosophical footwork. But didn't Giles also write a more controversial treatise? The one that's often seen as kind of laying the groundwork for the papal bull Unum Sanctum.
Ah, yes. You're talking about De Ecclesiastica Potice on ecclesiastical power.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a bold work, and it makes no apologies for its kind of pro-papal stance.
Okay, I'm ready for some strong papal pronouncements. What were Giles's main arguments in this treatise?
Okay, so he argues that the Pope, as the head of the church, is also the ultimate source of all power on earth, both spiritual and temporal.
Hold on. So kings and emperors, they get their authority from the Pope, not directly from God or the people.
That's how Giles saw it, yeah.
Yeah.
He believed the Pope has a kind of universal jurisdiction, delegating the temporal sword, so to speak, to secular rulers, but always retaining like ultimate sovereignty. Wow, that's a pretty expansive view of papal power.
It is.
And it basically makes the Pope a kind of global emperor, right? Ruling over both the spiritual and material realms.
You got it. And Giles even applies this logic to, things like property rights.
Mhm.
He argues that all ownership ultimately derives its legitimacy from papal authority.
So we're talking about a pretty radical vision of papal supremacy here,
Yeah.
something that goes way beyond anything we see in modern Catholicism.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's a view that has sparked a lot of debate among scholars, right?
Hmm.
Some see it as a kind of natural extension of, medieval ideas about the church's role in the world, while others view it as more of an outlier,
Right.
a product of, the specific political circumstances of Giles's time and his loyalty to Boniface VIII.
It's fascinating to see how these philosophical and theological ideas played out in the real world of power struggles and
Yeah.
political maneuvering. It shows that ideas have real consequences, especially when they're about who holds ultimate authority.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. And it's a reminder, I think, that even the most, abstract philosophical concepts can be used to support or challenge, existing power structures.
This deep dive into Giles of Rome has been incredible.
Yeah.
We've covered so much ground, from
Yeah.
the intricacies of logic and rhetoric to the mind-bending complexities of metaphysics and natural philosophy, all the way to the messy world of ethics and political theory. It's clear that he was a truly brilliant mind, wrestling with some of the biggest questions of his time.
Yeah, I think what's most striking about Giles is this constant drive to kind of synthesize and systematize knowledge, right?
Yeah.
He was always trying to bring together insights from, different fields, philosophy, theology, natural science, and weave them into a coherent whole.
It's like he was constructing this grand philosophical tapestry,
Right.
drawing on threads from Aristotle, Augustine, Averroes, Aquinas, all kind of woven together with his own, unique insights and interpretations.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Yeah, it reminds us, I think, that philosophy isn't just about, isolated ideas or arguments.
Mm-hmm.
It's about building systems of thought,
Mm-hmm.
right? Seeing how different concepts connect and relate to each other.
It's about recognizing that knowledge is interconnected, that we can learn from thinkers across disciplines and historical periods. And Giles, I think, embodies this spirit of intellectual synthesis perhaps better than anyone else in the late 13th century.
Yeah, he was fearless in engaging with, the greatest minds of the past, questioning their ideas and ultimately kind of forging his own path. But we shouldn't forget that Giles wasn't some, solitary genius working in isolation, right?
Mhm.
He was deeply embedded in a really vibrant intellectual community, engaging in debates and dialogues with other thinkers who, challenged him and helped him to refine his own positions.
It's like that saying, iron sharpens iron.
Right.
Giles's thinking was honed and sharpened through his interactions with other brilliant minds like Henry of Ghent, Geoffrey of Fontaines, and even Aquinas himself.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, those debates and disagreements, far from being a sign of weakness, are actually evidence of a healthy intellectual ecosystem. It's through those, clashes of perspectives
Yeah.
that we gain a deeper understanding of complex issues.
So Giles's legacy isn't just about the specific doctrines or arguments that he put forward. It's also about his contribution to a wider culture of philosophical inquiry and debate.
Absolutely, yeah. He helped to shape the intellectual landscape of the late 13th century, influencing generations of thinkers who came after him. And even though some of his ideas might seem, strange or outdated to us today, they still have a lot to teach us about, the power of reason, the importance of diverse perspectives, and the ongoing human quest to understand ourselves and the universe.
It's been an incredible journey exploring the life and thought of this often overlooked philosophical giant. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left wondering what Giles would have to say about the challenges and dilemmas that we face in the 21st century.
Ooh, that's a thought-provoking question.
Yeah.
It's impossible to know for sure, of course. But given, his deep interest in the relationship between faith and reason, his nuanced views on ethics and politics, and his willingness to grapple with difficult scientific questions, I think, Giles would have a lot to contribute to modern debates about artificial intelligence, bioethics, the role of religion in a secular world, you name it.
I can almost picture him engaging with, today's leading thinkers, drawing on his vast knowledge of Aristotle and Augustine, challenging assumptions, offering his own unique perspective on the pressing issues of our time.
Oh, I have no doubt he'd be right there in the thick of it, pushing us to think harder, question our biases, and search for truth wherever it may lead.
And that, I think, is the greatest legacy of Giles of Rome. He reminds us that philosophy isn't just an academic exercise.
Right.
It's a vital and ongoing conversation that shapes how we understand ourselves, our world, and our place within it.
Beautifully said. So to our listeners, as you go about your day, remember the example of Giles of Rome. Be curious, be engaged, be willing to challenge conventional wisdom, and never stop asking those big, important questions.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Giles of Rome. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the philosophical fire burning bright.